Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Science Behind the Crime. I'm your host, Gianna Newberry, and I'm really excited to get into this episode with you guys. Now, I had mentioned in the previous introductory episode, basically, that I had wanted to start every episode with kind of a cool concept related to science or math that has been used to solve a crime, or that in the future could even be used to solve a crime, of course with further development. So today I wanted to introduce this idea of using trigonometry and blood spatter analysis. This is actually like a really difficult concept, harder than I had initially thought. A few years ago I had actually written a paper about using trigonometry in relation to blood spatter analysis, and it was just hard because I was only looking at, the Pythagorean theorem, using SOHCAHTOA, sine, cosine, and tangent to determine where a blood spatter, or blood drip, whatever you want to call it, would land based on angle and distance. But unfortunately, in the real world, it is a lot more complex than that. There's cases where, for example, if a person is shot, you would have to take into account all kinds of things, such as air resistance, the speed of the bullet, the angle at which the bullet entered, and the angle at which it exited. It's a lot of things to consider, and I would totally be interested in researching this further, seeing if there have been any new developments, at least since I did this assignment those few years ago. But I just think it's so interesting that even trigonometry can offer some kind of insight, especially with blood spatter, because, it has a lot to do with angles, and yeah. So that was our fun little topic for today. So next up, I wanted to talk about a topic from Inquiry into Math and Science that I found really interesting. And to start this, I wanted to find something, and that is Locard's exchange principle. Now, forgive me if I'm saying the name wrong, but basically this principle holds that any two things that come into contact with each other will result in an exchange of something. And he said, and I quote, "It is impossible for a criminal to act, especially considering the intensity of a crime, without leaving traces of this presence." End quote. So this principle applies to literally everything, not just in the context of a criminal case. For example, I had an assignment where I had to wear a t-shirt all day, and I recorded my movements throughout that day, and then at the end of the day, I examined the t-shirt for any kinds of trace evidence. And I found all kinds of things, like dog hair, lint, I think it was a piece of my hair even, and believe it or not, a little dried splash of oat milk, which kind of grossed me out. But it's crazy, because you never think about just how much what you're wearing reflects your movements throughout the day. And you can apply this to forensics even. And there have been a lot of cases where a fiber or some other kind of trace evidence, I'm just saying fiber because it's one of the most common / well-known ones, but where either a fiber or some other kind of trace evidence ties someone to a crime. And today I actually wanted to talk about a case where there was trace evidence that eventually helped investigators come up with a conclusion to answer some questions. It wasn't just the trace evidence that led to this perpetrator being caught and arrested and everything, but the evidence definitely did help, especially in the court. So I'm sure many of you have actually heard about this case, and that is the Green River Killer case. I do want to put kind of a warning in here. There's going to be some mention of sexual assault and murder. I'm not going to get too graphic, but still, it's a very upsetting case, so listener discretion is advised. This all started on July 15th of 1982 when the body of Wendy Caulfield, who was 16 years old, was found floating in the Green River in Seattle. Now, over the following weeks, more bodies were found, either in the river or near the river. And all of these bodies were women, and all were strangled, just like Wendy Caulfield. On August 16th of the same year, the King County Sheriff's Office set up the Green River Task Force to investigate these killings in the area around Seattle and Tacoma. Unfortunately, over the next 2 years, the Green River Killer had sexually assaulted and murdered more than 40 women. And it wasn't until April 30th of 1983 that a man named Gary Ridgway became a suspect. In the spring of 1983, Marie Melvar, who was 18 at the time, was last seen by her boyfriend getting into a pickup truck with a dark-haired man who looked to be about 30 to 40 years old. Police questioned Ridgway about this, and of course he denied knowing Melvar. And a few months later, in November, police spoke to him again about the murders, and again he denied. Unfortunately, because authorities didn't have enough evidence to actually link him to the crimes, other than just suspecting that he had somewhat of a tie to it, they couldn't do anything about it, and I do want to mention that one important reason Ridgway was a person of interest before any solid evidence was found was due to his association with sex workers in that area. And as it turns out, a lot of these victims were actually sex workers. If they weren't sex workers, they were runaways, but most of the time they were both. Ridgway knew that the police were keeping somewhat of an eye on him, and so he would even reach out to the police and offered what appeared to be help or assistance, to make it seem like he was innocent and just wanted to be a good civilian helping out the police. And in 1984, he even took a polygraph test where he denied committing any of the murders, and guess what? He actually passed. This is why we call it a polygraph test and not a lie detector test. But moving on. So there was actually another victim that allegedly was last seen with Ridgway. So this makes a total of 2 victims that Ridgway was the last person to have seen. Allegedly, of course. So this prompted police to later search his house and his vehicles in 1987. And Ridgway, at this point, had actually given the police a sample of his saliva. But keep in mind, it was 1987, so DNA testing at the time was barely being developed. It wasn't advanced enough to the point where the sample would have tied him to the crimes the way now a sample like that would. So they weren't really able to do much with his DNA, and they weren't able to arrest him, so he remained a free man. It wasn't until more than a decade later, in March of 2001, when advancements in forensic testing had developed, investigators took another look at the evidence from the Green River Killer case, and that is when they found that new DNA profiles from 3 of the victims were a match to Ridgway's saliva sample. So the sample that he willingly gave actually bit him in the butt. This led to his eventual arrest in November 30th of 2001, and he was initially arrested in connection to 4 of the earlier victims from this case, but after his arrest, he admitted to killing so many women that he actually forgot how many it was that he killed in total. I mean, the total number is thought to be up to around 70 women, but they have only confirmed 48 victims. In order to avoid the death penalty, he agreed to give information about these murders and where some of the bodies were, the bodies that had not yet been found. Ridgway entered a guilty plea to 48 charges of aggravated first-degree murder. And he later explained that he chose women he thought were sex workers because he thought A, they were easier to pick up without being noticed, and B, they wouldn't be reported missing, either right away or even ever, and unfortunately, he was right. That is actually why he went so long without being caught. So I had mentioned how DNA found on 3 of these victims were later matched to Ridgway using that saliva sample, but another piece of evidence that was also linked to Ridgway was spray paint. So I want to preface this by saying that Ridgway actually worked as a spray painter for a company, and so there were paint samples found on Ridgway that were collected by police, and small traces of spray paint were also found on the clothes of 3 of the murder victims. Now, whether these victims were the same ones that had the DNA on them, I'm not sure, but yes, there were 3 victims that had small traces of spray paint. So the thing about spray paint is that when it goes through the air, it forms tiny balls that dry, which are so small that you can't see them with your eyes. You need a microscope. And eventually, scientists used a microscope to generate a unique chemical fingerprint of several of the paint samples associated with Ridgway that had been collected. These paint particles found on the victims were a match to the particles found on Gary Ridgway, so this was more evidence that was used at the trial against Ridgway. Gary Ridgway committed several vile acts, some of which I didn't even mention. We don't need to go there. I just wanted to briefly outline the case and mention how trace evidence helped come to the conclusion that Gary Ridgway was the Green River Killer. Thanks to forensic advancements, he will be spending the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. This is just one example of how these technological advancements have impacted the world of forensics so much. Currently, there are thousands of cases where trace evidence is being retested, evidence from cases dating back several years that is being looked at again thanks to all of these advancements. One thing that you see a lot nowadays is people who have been falsely imprisoned that years later are proven innocent by this retesting of evidence. So I hope you all enjoyed this episode of The Science Behind the Crime, where we touched on trace evidence, Lockhardt's exchange principle, and we kind of talked a little bit about the Green River Killer case. If you want to know more about the case, I'm going to put some links down below, some articles that you can read. It's a very interesting case, but one thing I do want to mention that I also mentioned in the previous episode is that we must not become desensitized. These are real victims. This is a real thing that happened, and we must have respect for these victims, their families. And so, yes, in the Wikipedia page below, you can see the names of the victims. And yeah, just I hope this episode was insightful, and stay safe, everyone. I'll see you next time.